So firstly, good morning, afternoon or evening, wherever you are. Welcome to another ESCoE webinar on economic measurement with a focus on COVID-19. It is the last one of this year, sad to say, an interesting year. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Sanjeev Mahajan. I've worked for many years in the Office for National Statistics and Economic Statistics. I'm now the head of methods and research engagement. Two quick points I'd like to raise before we get going on the topic of the day. The ESCoE webinars will be resuming in the new year with a further series, likely to start on the 14th of January with the Honourable Martin Wheel. Obviously, more details will be made available nearer the time. The second point of note, for anyone who's interested, and we are encouraging you to do so, because it's an opportunity even more so in a virtual environment. The 2021 ESCoE conference call for papers, the closing date is the 16th of January, not long. So over the Christmas New Year period, if you're interested, please submit an abstract and a title, a paper, etc. into the pot by the 16th of January. So moving a little bit closer now to the topic of the day, mapping career causeways for workers displaced by automation and COVID-19. As we're all aware, COVID-19 has had a massive impact on the labour market dimension of the economy, nationally and internationally, regionally. The increase in unemployment is clear. Furloughed staff in the UK, sadly to say, many of whom next year may well end up in the unemployment category. And also on top of that, the impacts of automation. So as part of Nesta's Mapping Career Causeways project, they've developed a different approach, a new approach, for identifying viable and desirable job transition pathways to secure more employment. And they've linked data through a skills and occupation classification. And this has got a lot of innovation and novelty about it on an area that we should all be able to relate to. The presentation will be about 40 minutes. Points for clarification in the chat will be welcomed. There will be clear time for questions and answers at the end. To note, the session will be recorded and the presentation will be placed on the ESCoE website thereafter, probably tomorrow. So I thank the various people involved in advance. So now over to Karlis Kanders, who's the data scientist at Nesta, to provide the presentation. So Karlis, over to yourself. Thank you.
Thanks, Sanju. And thank you all for joining this webinar. And I just wanted to also thank the Economic Statistics Center of Excellency and Sarah and Sanju and Rebecca Riley for inviting Nesta to present the Mapping Career Causeways project. So I'm sure many of you already are familiar with Nesta, but just for those who maybe aren't, please let me spend only 1 minute on introductions. We are a UK-based innovation foundation, and with a mission to bring bold ideas to life and to change the world for good. And so we are an independent charity, and we work across various fields, such as education, healthcare, public sector services, and also the labor market. And within the data science team at Nesta, there is a small group of us that focuses on improving labor market information. And this is the Open Jobs data team. And through the Open Jobs program, we have been working on data-driven innovative projects for helping people navigate their future careers, skills, and job opportunities. And some of the team's most exciting projects have been actually supported by the Economic Statistics Center of Excellency. For example, you might know that the open data-driven taxonomy of skills that was extracted from online job postings and developed by my colleagues, Jill Jumalieva and Cass Sleeman. And so about a year ago, Nesta released a manifesto called Precarious to Prepared that summarizes kind of our vision for an empowering labor market. And now, a year later, the problems and calls outlined in this manifesto, of course, have only become more salient as we're trying to recover from the COVID-19 shock. And so this brings us to the Mapping Career Causeways project, which is being carried out by the team that you see here on the right, and which is funded by JP Morgan Chase Foundation as part of their New Skills at Work initiative. So the project has two main aims. And the first aim, which is slightly narrower, is to identify how workers in roles at risk due to automation can build on their existing skills and experience and transition to more secure jobs. And the second, sort of more broader aim, is to develop a methodology for measuring the resilience of workers to various types of economic shocks, of which automation is only one example. And also, of course, we would include COVID-19 as another example. And by resilience, we mean kind of how mobile the workers are in terms of their career prospects and transitions. So we just published a report back in November about the project, but today I will give you sort of a brief overview, and then I will go a little bit deeper into the methodology that we used for recommending career transitions to the more secure jobs. And then I will show you several use cases and some key findings related to the career transition opportunities and upskilling. So at a glance, through this work, we have built, in a sense, a map of occupations that can help to identify potential pathways from high risk to safer occupations. And the crucial step was to measure the similarities between over 1,500 different occupations based on their skills, work activities, and also more broader interpersonal, physical, and structural aspects of the job. And on the right-hand side of this slide, you can see a visualization of this map, where each dot is an occupation, and their placement in the map depends on their similarity to other occupations. So occupations that have similar skills are naturally grouped together, and we can find a cluster, for example, related to sales and services workers, sort of in the mid part of the map. And in this cluster, we can find occupations such as, for example, the hotel concierge, and right next to it, there's ticket sales agents. And then on the other side, you can see digital media designer. So this is in the top of the map. And this occupation is in between the ICT and media clusters, reflecting the requirements of both types of skills in this job. And so as the next step, we can overlay the risk of automation over this map. Or more specifically, we're using this suitability of tasks for machine learning measure that was developed by Brynjolfsson and colleagues. And you can immediately appreciate, for example, that the automation risk is concentrated in clusters in this occupational landscape. For example, in the sales and services sector, or another one in the business administration, and also in the more digitally intensive ICT and media roles. And one clear takeaway from this is that the closest transitions for at-risk workers will not necessarily be automation safe. And therefore, at-risk workers who might be displaced by technological change will have to make larger leaps to reach safer occupations. And this indeed, we can see that if we also measure the number of viable and desirable transitions that each occupation has to other more secure jobs. And in a minute, I will explain how exactly we did this. And so in this visualization, we are indicating the number of transitions by the size of the circles. And we use a conceptual framework that was set out by experts from the World Economic Forum and also the OECD, where we talk about the viable transition as one which is a good fit in terms of skills and work characteristics, and desirable transitions have at least a similar level of compensation. And so you can appreciate that the range of transition options varies widely across occupations and depends on the worker's position in the map. And so just in a second, we'll talk also a bit more about the nitty-gritty details and how we arrive at these measures. And after this webinar, I also invite you to visit the Nesta website, and you can find a data visualization where you can actually explore a bit more this map. So just to kind of put this into kind of context, so we think that there are at least 3 use cases for such a map of occupations. And we think that this kind of tool has the potential to help policymakers, as well as providers of training and career services, employers and individuals to prepare for the changing labor market. Basically, kind of the vision or the hope is to eventually arrive at some sort of Google Maps for jobs and skills. And so the use cases are the following. So number 1 is to recommend job transitions by identifying the viable and desirable transitions. So we can answer questions like, what other occupations can I move to? Where can I apply my skills? The second use case is to support workers at risk by mapping the impact of shocks. So which workers might find it most challenging to adapt to shocks because they simply don't have too many viable options to find other occupation, other employment. And then the third use case is to provide skill recommendations. So what skills are required to move between 2 jobs, and what training should be offered to the displaced workers. So this is kind of a very broad overview and kind of the outcome, one of the outcomes of the project. And so now let me give you a sort of a bit of a deep dive into the methodology. And so the project had 3 main parts. And the first part was to measure the automation risk. And so the project was started, of course, before the COVID-19 crisis hit. And so the focus really in the beginning was in automation. And then as the situation developed, we also included sort of measures that highlight the occupations sort of exposure to the impacts from COVID. And I will also talk about this more a bit later in the webinar. But so in terms of the automation risk, so we used task automation scores developed by Brynjolfsson and Mitchell and Rock in a study back in 2018, where they estimated the suitability for machine learning for about 18,000 tasks in the ONIT database. And then we translated these task automation scores to the European context by developing a novel crosswalk, so a direct crosswalk between ONIT and ESCoE occupations. And so this allowed us to use the ESCoE framework, and ESCoE framework has a large number of occupations. So we used 1,600 occupations, which kind of are at the top level of ESCoE occupational hierarchy. But in total, there are about 3,000 distinct occupations in this database. And then we developed 2 sets of automation risk measures, where one is very simple, the sort of average automatability across all job tasks. And the other one is slightly more novel, which is what we call sort of bottleneck tasks. So we measure the prevalence of difficult to automate tasks in a job. And in a second, I'll explain a bit more what it means. And so this allowed us to identify high-risk occupations. And then as a second part of the project, we aimed to shift the focus from the occupations to the actual workers. And so we used EU labor force survey to identify the demographic patterns of automation in 3 countries, in the UK, in France, and in Italy. We also wanted to access the data from Germany, but we had some issues with accessing the labor force survey data. And yeah, and so just to flag, I will not go into detail about how we derived the crosswalk between ONIT and ESCoE, but I think this is something that might be of actually great interest to the audience. So I just wanted to flag that we did it by combining automated mapping using sentence embeddings and also manual validation. And the crosswalk and the corresponding code is now publicly available. It's hosted in our GitHub repository, which is linked in the presentation. And you can also find full details on the approach and also the code in the project report. And so we're very happy if you use it, and also if you suggest improvements, and yeah, it's on the GitHub. And then regarding automation risk, so I mentioned these 2 aspects of automation that we measured. And so the idea behind the first one, the overall automation risk, is that every occupation in the ESCoE framework, we can now assign the tasks from ONIT to these occupations. And for each of these tasks, we have a suitability for machine learning score. And we also have weights about the importance of this task in the occupation. And so we can arrive at a weighted average suitability for machine learning of this occupation. And this is measured between 1 and 5, with 5 being sort of high suitability for machine learning. And then we also have another measure that is prevalent called the prevalence of bottleneck tasks. And there, the idea is that each of these tasks is, in the original study by Brynjolfsson and colleagues, was rated on 23 different aspects that describe sort of the different aspects of suitability and sort of how amenable these tasks to machine learning. And so we simply looked at whether any one of these dimensions has a score which is lower than a threshold that we set to be 2. So they can be rated between 1 and 5. And so if a single dimension is lower than, equal or lower than 2, then we take this task to be as a bottleneck task. And then we arrive at a sort of summary metric, which is the prevalence of these bottleneck tasks in occupation. And there we also use the importance weights. And so basically, this allows us to measure these kind of the risk of automation in a more well-rounded way. So in this graph, you can see on x-axis the overall automation risk, whereas on y-axis the prevalence of bottleneck tasks. And so you can see we have highlighted what we identified. We set basically that occupations that have both high overall automation risk, so they are in the 4th quartile of automation risk, that have low prevalence of bottleneck tasks. So in the 1st quartile of this measure, we designate these as high risk. These are in the red color. And some examples you can see, for example, hotel concierge or medical transcriptionist or investment clerk. And generally, the typical high-risk occupations were sales and services, clerical businesses, and administration and financial associate professional jobs. You can also see some examples of low risk, like for example, dancer or first equipment operator. So these are kind of occupations that have so lots of bottlenecks to automation. Usually the bottlenecks that are kind of the most salient are related to dexterity or manual labor. And this kind of highlighted that if there is a big leap in advancement of robotics, then lots of occupations that have at the moment a large number of bottlenecks actually lose their bottlenecks. But so this was kind of about the automation risk. And now for actually the rest of the presentation, I would like to go more into detail about how we mapped the transition options for the different occupations. And so I will go more into detail about this part. Just as an overview, we basically joined up the ESCoE on data sets, and we also added some other external data sets. And then we went through sort of an algorithm to identify safe and desirable transitions. And then in addition to that, we also performed analysis of the skills involved in these transitions. So we could identify detailed skills gaps, and also we identified upskilling opportunities. And in all of this, we used sort of a mixture of methods, including also natural language processing. So the general approach for finding viable and desirable job transitions, as I mentioned, this came from the previous studies by OECD or World Economic Forum, where we distinguish between the viable and desirable transitions. And the general approach was that we first build detailed occupational profiles. So we combined data from ESCoE and ONIT, and then we measure occupation similarity, and we derived 4 measures of occupational similarity based on different aspects of these occupations. And then we identified viable transitions by calibrating sort of our expectation of what similarity value indicates the transition is viable. And then the fourth step was to identify desirable transitions by looking at their average annual earnings. And finally, of course, we wanted to identify safe transitions, so only allow destinations that have lower automation risk. I'll also show you some examples where we assess the exposure to COVID-19. And so this is how an example of an occupational profile looks like. So this is a hotel concierge who is at high risk of automation. And we have different aspects that we can measure. So we can measure the education experience level from ONIT. And this we did with using the job zone parameter, which describes sort of the level of preparedness that worker needs in this occupation. And it is measured between 1 and 5, where 1 is, for example, something like laundry workers, where you need very little preparation, and 5 is, for example, for judges, where you need sort of long years of training. Then we had annual earnings that we mapped from the ASH tables, so from the annual survey of hours and earnings from ONS. And then we have important features like the work context features from ONIT. So we could map these to desk occupations using the novel crosswalk. And these are the interpersonal, structural, and physical work context features. So for example, they describe how intensively you need to use the telephone or do face-to-face discussions, or how much time pressure you have at the work, or things like how much time you need to spend sitting or standing or exposed to weather. And then last but definitely not least, we also have at our disposal the 13,000 different unique skills from the ESCoE database. And these skills have been sort of designated as either essential or optional. And the skills have also been grouped into categories which correspond to the similar types of work activity. And these categories are also given by the ESCoE framework. So they recently released, well, not anymore recently, but like in May this spring, they released a hierarchy of the occupations, which is kind of related to the intermediate work activities of ONIT actually. And so for example, you can see like essential skills of hotel concierge are to identify customers' needs or to provide tourism-related information. And then the types of work activities are like obtaining information verbally or negotiating. So here, basically, I'm just summarizing the different types of data we used. And in addition, we also employed recently published remote labor index, which was designed by researchers from Oxford. And so then we use these occupational profiles to compare the different jobs. And so I will go through kind of a set of flow charts explaining a bit the process, and bear with me. So the first step is to measure occupational similarity. As I mentioned, we did it in 4 different ways. And the 4 measures are as follows. So we measured the overlap of essential skills and also the overlap of optional skills. And in particular, we measured the overlap of so specifically the essential and optional skills, the origin occupation, and compare these to the essential skills at the destination occupation. And in both of these cases, so we measured this overlap using a slightly sort of novel method we developed, which is called the natural NLP adjusted overlap. So we use natural language processing. And the idea was to kind of have a more flexible way of looking at overlaps. So, you know, if you look at something like Jakarta distance, you assume that you would assume that each skill is completely different from the others. So using NLP, we can kind of get more flexibility, and we can find also partial overlaps. And I'll show you some examples later on. And then we also looked at so the alignment of work activity types. So this is the 3rd measure. And here we employed ESCoE skills hierarchy, and we constructed feature vectors that we simply compared the distances between the vectors. And then the 4th similarity was based on these work context features. And again, we constructed a feature vector and measured the distance between the vectors. And so as the next step, we aggregated these 4 measures by doing a simple average, because I didn't really have strong priors of which of these measures should be more important. And the rationale was to use sort of measures that are of different granularity. So the essential skills from ESCoE, they're really specific. Also the optional skills are specific. And so this is kind of really granular measure of similarity. And then as we go to work activities, this is sort of a bit more broader, and then work context features are sort of a very broad assessment of the similarity. So we get a more comprehensive assessment in general of the relationships between occupations. And so just looking at the results, sort of what are the, for each occupation, what are the most similar other occupations that we can find. And these were quite satisfactory just by kind of qualitative sort of assessment. So for example, like for a choreographer, you find that the most similar ones are artistic coach or fight director or dancer. And then for a shop manager, you find it the most similar supermarket manager or shop supervisor. And just to give kind of a little bit more insight into how we did this comparison of occupational skill sets. So for the essential optional skills, so here we used sentence BERT embeddings, and we generated embeddings for each of the ESCoE skills. So we use the skills descriptions, which are kind of one or more sentences long description to this of what the skill entails. And then in the second step, we compared for each occupations, you have two sets of embeddings. So we compared and found the best pairwise one-to-one matches of skills. And then we filtered a bit these similarity values to kind of filter out low quality matches. And then we simply averaged these matching scores to find the final value. And what is maybe interesting to note is that this measure is asymmetric. So if you go in this example, if you go from sort of the first occupation to the second, then the final value is 0.43. But if you go from the other way, then kind of there is no, so in the other way, the first occupation doesn't need the skill number 4. So you can think about this in a way that if you think about transitions from more junior to senior occupations, so, or vice versa, right? Like you would expect that the transition difficulty should be different depending on the direction of the transition. So we try to account for this in this way. And just to show you an example of how this looks like in real life. So here we have a transition from shop assistant to the visual merchandiser. And so using this method, we can identify not only perfectly overlapping skills, which are here shown on the top of this list in the green color, but we also can identify partial matches, which are shown in orange. And some nice ones that you can see are, for example, in the second row, supervised merchandise displays is matched with coaching team on visual merchandising. So it kind of finds these kind of relationship, that there's something similar to do with merchandising. So just for context, like visual merchandisers are involved in kind of the visual display of retail goods in a shop. And another nice match is to identify customers' needs has been matched to liaise with appropriate staff for visual display. So both skills had to do something with communication. And so this has also been picked up. And then what is also nice is in the red color, so I have highlighted the potential skill gaps. So these are matched skills where the semantic similarity is lower than 0.8. So this is kind of a heuristic threshold we found below which kind of the matches, kind of the quality of the matches deteriorates quickly. And you can also see the last column is matching score, where we basically use this simple sigmoid function to kind of threshold these values. And so we can use these semantic similarity or matching scores to rank, of course, these matches. And so you can see at the bottom of the list, we have skills, the destination occupation that might be the least familiar for shop assistant. So for example, interpreting floor plans, or conducting research on trends in design, or executing visual presentation changes. So this kind of gives us opportunity to kind of quickly interrogate sort of lists of skills and identify the potential kind of needs for upskilling and reskilling. Then for the activities and work context, as I quickly explained before, we use occupational feature vectors, and I won't spend too much time on this, but simply we designed a vector where each element corresponds to either, so in this example for this different skills categories, then we measure the kind of the intensity of each of these skills categories, which correspond to the different types of work activities. And then we calculated the Euclidean distance between the vectors and applied some rescaling and manipulations to kind of get the distances or the similarities rather between 0 and 1. And alternatively, you could also do the same thing with cosine similarities. And I think there is not a sort of big difference of the outcome. And then we combine all these similarity measures and using the equally weighted average. And so we get sort of a comprehensive combined similarity measure. And then the next step was to identify the viable transitions by calibrating the similarity threshold. So we used the combined similarity measure, and I'll explain how we, so basically to do the calibration, we leveraged the detailed, the sort of deep hierarchy of ESCoE occupations. And so ESCoE occupations, so at the top level, we have 436 ESCoE 08 unit groups. These are the 4-digit occupational groups. And then the ESCoE occupations that we analyzed are the top level, or you could think about them as ESCoE level 5 occupations, of which there are about 1,600. And then there's sort of, and then so to calculate the calibrate the viability threshold, we assumed that transitions between occupations that are in the same ESCoE 4-digit unit group should be viable. And so we can measure the similarity, the typical similarity between these kind of transitions across the different 4-digit unit groups. And then this gives us an indication of what we should expect to be the similarity value for viable transitions. And then we did the same exercise also to get what we call highly viable transitions. And there we used sort of a more granular level of this hierarchy. So this basically shows you what I just explained about a calibration. And on the right-hand side, you can see the distribution of these within group occupation similarities for all of the ESCoE 4-digit groups. And interestingly, there is quite a bit of variation. And so the kind of the median value is about 0.4, and the occupational groups that were kind of the most similar, or the most like the occupational groups with the highest within group similarity were, I think, driving instructors, and then the ones with the smallest within group similarity were I think armed forces occupations. And so to kind of include, then we kind of, the question was where exactly we set the viability threshold given this sort of variation of the within group similarities. And so we decided to set it at the mean minus 1 standard deviation. Then we rounded it to the first decimal digit, and so this ended up to be 0.3 is our viability threshold. And so this allowed us to kind of quantify the number of viable transitions for each occupation. That said, we also are at the moment conducting sort of a crowdsourcing exercise. We're actually gauging the people's perceptions of the viability of the transitions. And so this will allow us to, as a next step, to even calibrate this threshold a bit better, and also just gauge the kind of the validity of this threshold. Yeah, and then the final two steps were to identify, in addition to viability, also the safety and desirability of these transitions. So in terms of desirability, we used salary from the ASH tables, and we kind of made quite a lenient threshold. So we said that the transitions, so the destination occupation shouldn't have a lower salary than 75% of the origin occupation. And we chose this leniency because, one, because there is a bit of uncertainty in the estimations of the salaries, and also because there can be quite a spread in terms of even within a single occupation, there would be quite a spread of what people might earn. And then in addition to this, we also had a measure for looking at impact from COVID-19. So the exposure score, what we call the exposure score, is a geometric mean of 1 minus remote labor index. So this kind of tells us whether the occupation, whether it's possible, or rather whether it's impossible to work remotely. And then the other element is also the physical proximity to other people, so how close you are. And this we took from the on-at-work context features. And so in some examples that I'll show you in a bit, it's like the transitions that have a smaller exposure score. And so we also include this into our desirability ratings. And then the final step was to identify, of course, safe transitions. So in terms of automation, and there we had a couple of different conditions where, in one definition of safe is that this occupation simply shouldn't be at high risk of automation. So this we used when we compare occupations that are at high risk versus occupations that have lower risk. But then the other more stricter condition was that the transition should both be not at high risk, and the destination should be not at high risk, and the transition should also reduce your automation risk and increase the prevalence of bottleneck tasks. So this is a bit more a stringent criterion that we use only when we compare the high risk occupations amongst themselves. And so this was kind of deep dive into the methodology. And so now for the remainder of the time, and I realize that we don't have had too much running time, but I will show you kind of quickly the kind of applications of this methodology for different use cases that I outlined in the very beginning. So one is to recommend job transitions. And for this, let me quickly show you a sort of a demo where we are trying to look at transitions for a shop assistant. And our data tells us that this role is at high risk of automation and also at high exposure to the impacts from COVID-19. And so the shop assistant needs to move jobs. There are about 50 different jobs that we find that they might wish to consider. So we can zoom in at the 15 most viable occupations, and then we can assess the different aspects of these transitions. So we can look at the different, so if we can look at the similarity, and we can find the most similar, unsurprisingly, is the transition to sales assistant or specialized seller, and the least similar are car leasing agents. And then we can also look at, we can break it down into the different types of similarity measures. So we can look at in terms of work activities or in terms of the specific skills, but then we can also do more than that. And so we can also look at the average annual earnings of the different transition destinations and compare these to the shop assistant's average annual earnings. So this allows us to highlight which might be the more desirable transitions. And at the moment, we don't have sort of data on the vacancies by single occupations, but we can use perhaps the total employment in each job as a rough estimate of the potential opportunities. And then importantly, we also want to look at, of course, the risks of these transition destinations. For example, for the shop assistant, we find that many of the most viable transitions are actually at high risk of automation. And so this is what we also touched upon a bit before when we looked at the map of transitions. And so unfortunately, kind of we have to swap them out for something that is sort of a more secure position. So we can do that. And then we can also assess the COVID-19 impact. For example, we can see that occupations like the tanning consultant or like beauty salon attendant are also not at the moment perhaps the best options. And so we can also swap these out. And so we arrive sort of at the final set of destination occupations that, you know, a career guidance counselor might suggest to a job seeker. And then we can also go one step further, and we can also ask the question, okay, which new skills might be beneficial for me to train, and to what options does it open for me? So in this example, we're showing you that if the shop assistant acquires a skill to manage staff, then there are a few more transition options that appear. For example, to become office manager or become advertising assistant. And finally, we just highlight a few options that that the worker might wish to consider. And generally, we hope that such a tool could be used to broaden career horizons for workers and show the transferability of their skills and experiences. And it may act as a useful starting point when searching for a job. And so, coming back to the presentation, I also definitely need to mention that we are fully aware that this kind of algorithm does not account for all potential barriers to worker mobility. And these recommendations are just the first step to appreciate the full range of one's transition options. And we know that in reality, workers face various additional challenges. And each worker will also have their own unique sets of skills and preferences. And importantly, the framework will also need to be enriched with timely data on local vacancies, occupation growth forecasts, and skills training opportunities. And also, a big part of this broader effort is to influence recruiting practices, so that employers also consider perhaps candidates from other sectors. So until March 2021, we are conducting research to validate the career transitions algorithm and understand how it can be applied in practice. And I should also mention that we will release the code and also all the transitions early next year in January. And this is the first version of the algorithm. And so we're really happy to receive feedback, either as issues in the GitHub repo or as emails or one-to-ones, and really keen to hear your feedback, and also for you to contribute and to keep improving this framework. So with a little bit of the remainder of the time, let me show you some examples also how we can support workers at risk by mapping the impact of shocks, and sort of some of the key findings related to this. So as we have established, that there is a strong localization of automation risk in the occupational landscape. And so this leads, so on the left-hand side, we have the overall automation risk. On the right-hand side, we have the prevalence of bottleneck tasks. And this localization leads to kind of exacerbates the differences between the high-risk occupations and the lower-risk occupations. So by lower risk, we mean all the occupations that are not high risk. And we find that the sort of big difference between the average number of safe and desirable transitions. And in terms of the median number of transitions, the difference is also significant, and it's 42%. So it's quite easy to understand why, because due to the localization of the high risk, many of the high risk jobs tend to concentrate in clusters of related occupations. And so to escape your cluster of high risk, you need to leave your confines of this cluster and forego many of the most readily available transition options. And in the report, we explain a bit more, and there is some additional analysis related to this. And also, just a thing to note is that there is a large variation in terms of the transition options among the high-risk occupations. So some workers will need more support than others. In this histogram, I'm showing you the number of safe and desirable transitions of high-risk occupations that simultaneously reduce automation risk and increase the prevalence of bottleneck tasks. And on the right-hand side, you can see some examples of occupations with the least transitions and the most transitions. And you can, by looking at this list, you can probably kind of guess that the occupational groups that have the greatest number of transitions are managers, professionals, and technicians, whereas service and sales workers and clerical support workers and elementary occupations have a smaller number of transitions. But even among ESCoE 4-digit unit groups, there can be large variation. For example, among transport clerks, there are examples where rail traffic controllers have no viable transitions, and then taxi controllers have 5, and water traffic coordinators have 10 transitions. And the salient difference is about kind of their mix of skills. And then importantly, also high-risk workers with less training and work experience have lower mobility. So there is a twofold difference in the median number of transitions between occupations that may require secondary school qualification and minimal work experience. So this would be the job zone 2 occupations that require slightly more advanced level of experience. This would be job zone 3. And if you compare this to the undergraduate set of occupations that require undergraduate degree, which is job zone 4, the difference becomes fourfold. And so I think at this point, I'll just quickly highlight some other types of analyses that we did and that you can find in the report. So for example, we also looked at what we call skills-based sectors. So occupations that we clustered together into clusters based on their underlying skills and work activities and work context features. And we also assessed their number of, so the average number of transition options for occupations from different skills-based sectors. And we found it both like clerical business administration workers and sales and services workers have lower number of transitions, and also arts and media workers, most of which are the digitally intensive, like multimedia artists and animators, which just points towards kind of the fact that they have quite unique sets of skills. But probably they're not at risk of automation because people still expect, you know, the outputs to be made by humans. And then finally, and importantly, so we also realized how COVID-19 raises the hurdles for at-risk workers. And so we found that roles in the sales and services skills-based sector are exposed both to automation, and they also have high potential impact from COVID-19. And among these occupations, and so in addition, these occupations also tend to have small number of transitions that I'm showing here on the right-hand side. And so among these occupations, we find service roles like stewards, tourist information officers, or ticket sales agents, or retail and sales roles like cashiers and promotions demonstrators that have below median number of safe transition options and above median exposure to COVID-19 risks. And we know that we already know that in response to the pandemic, like some of the major UK retailers have already announced the shutting down of stores and substantial job cuts in order to focus on online shopping. And importantly, also, this kind of wide-ranging labor market shock like COVID-19 also affects the range of destinations for the precarious workers. And so this is the last example that I'm showing you, that the 2/3 of the safe and desirable transition workers for the at-risk sales and services workers, the 2/3 of their transitions remain within the sales and services occupations, and only about 40% of these have smaller potential impact from COVID-19. And the safer destination roles include predominantly the customer representative roles, and as well as some wholesale merchant occupations. And then in the case of a sector-wide downturn, you might want to transition to other occupations, like for example, in the business administration sector. And in this case, actually more of the transitions in the business administration sector are with a reduced impact from COVID-19. And so pathways to business administration destinations may present safer alternatives to those workers who have these options available. So with this, I think I will finish and open the floor for questions. Just to highlight that, let me go to the last slide. So just to highlight that the report is published, and you can read it by clicking on this link. And then we also invite you to look at the interactive data visualization, and as well as visit our GitHub repository. And I thank you very much for the attention, and I'm very happy to answer questions. I'm sure there are many questions.
Thank you very much, Karlis. I think that's very intriguing, very fascinating. I'll come back to your presentation in a moment to kickstart some questions. I know there's one question come up already in the chat. I would encourage other people, if you've got any thoughts, comments, or questions, to do so. But before I go first to Hassan, Bakshi. I've got a couple of thoughts. Firstly, your presentation is really, really good because it's based on a lot of data observations, and there's a lot of policy links that you could develop here, from central government to local government, to which areas of education to invest in, whether it's higher or further, and the transition from different types of professions and skills. So I just wanted to focus a little bit on defining what is a secure job, and the elasticity to the type of shock or transition, but with a key element. The time dimension is key, how long things take. So for example, some of the automation takes some time, some is maybe quick, some of the shocks are very quick, and some may not be linked to, say, for example, COVID. It may be a company just doesn't want the post anymore, or they're cutting down on costs, and they're overnight type shocks, etc. And obviously the transition from a high risk post to a high risk post, or high risk to low risk, or low risk to high risk, takes time. It may require education. It may be that transferable skills are there, but the time element, I don't know how you factor the time in, and thoughts on that. So obviously, for example, you've got your shop till operator moving to the self-service tills, the job for life in a bank. There's no such thing. They've got rid of the till operators. There's internet banking, there's machines, people wandering around with iPads, checking if you're happy or not. So the time dimension of some of these transitions are really important. One comment I just wanted to add is, it's quite interesting in the last month, the ESCoE, as in the Economic Statistics Centre of Excellence. Sometimes some people are now starting to confuse with ESCoE as in the European Skills and Occupational Classifications. So this draw a delineation. The first ESCoE is not doing anything with the second one in terms of setting up. That's a European thing, but that's just the delineations in case people will get confused. And my final question is, for economic researchers, are they deemed to be high risk or low risk? Over to you.
Thank you very much for your kind words and for your questions. So regarding the time aspect, this is extremely important, and this is still in a kind of an open question. Another open question is also to estimate the difficulty of bridging certain skill gaps. So at the moment, the way it stands is that we have this kind of NLP-based matching, that we probably should enrich it with kind of some kind of expectation of how difficult it is to learn a particular skill. And this would then lead also directly to better estimates of the time necessary for training. And we have some ideas maybe how to approach it, but at the moment we haven't done that yet. And one way how we tried to account a little bit for that was to use this job zone parameter from ONIT, where basically it relates to the level of education as well as to the level of work experience and on the job training. And so we use it to constrain the transitions so that you wouldn't have to have, so that the change in the job zone parameter wouldn't be larger than ±1. But this is definitely still an open question. I'm also aware of some work by OECD that have tried to estimate both the cost and time, but kind of the analysis was a bit less granular in terms of skills. Then related to the, I guess your question was a bit on the elasticity of risks, so the different types of risks. So here, so the hope and the idea is that, so we will publish this framework openly, and then hopefully we can enrich it further with better estimates of the impact from COVID. Like, for example, there's some tremendous work by researchers from Oxford measuring the supply and demand shocks in different occupations and industries. So trying to map this information on this framework would be interesting and useful. Also mapping live data and vacancies would be amazing to this framework. And there is an ongoing project in Nesta called Open Jobs Observatory, where we're kind of aiming to release sort of timely insights and skills demands, as well as occupational sort of vacancies, and eventually, hopefully, to also link it to this framework and to the ESCoE occupations. And then about economic researchers, that's a good question, and I think probably our work is already impacted by machine learning for sure, but I don't know if we're going to be automated anyway, probably not.
Economic researchers, long live economic researchers. So on that note, what I'll do is I'll move to Hassan Bakshi. We're going to unmute you if you want to ask your question, please, Hassan.
Thanks, Sanjeev, and great presentation, Karlis. I had a couple of questions about methodology. One is, are there tensions in using only tasks to assess the automatability of occupations, but when you're using skills and activities and a much richer set of variables to measure similarity between occupations? And the second question, I was just wondering how sensitive were the results that, to the measure of similarity you used. So if you use only one of the four instead of the average to get that more comprehensive measure you described.
Thank you for the questions. In terms of the first question, so the using tasks for gauging the automation risk, there are definitely limitations. And for example, I think that one of the limitations is that somehow it seems that the creative aspects are maybe a bit undervalued, or also the sort of the creative aspects in terms of reducing the automation risk. So this kind of consideration is not so strong with this measure. And also effective labor kind of is also a limitation. For example, you can find that occupations like counselors or even I think religious sort of occupations are deemed high risk. And it's really counterintuitive, but it's a limitation of the method. And I think there's still some work either to fine-tune these estimates, but I think even more importantly, we need to do better measurement of the actual impact of automation that is having on actual jobs and kind of the job losses. And I think this is still an open discussion, how reliable are these estimates of automation, either Freer-Osborne or Brynjolfsson or others. And then in addition, we probably also should incorporate measures such as the one developed by Hassan Bakshi himself, about, that incorporates all kinds of different trends and uses also mixed methods to estimate the probability of growth, in the next decade of an occupation, like in this study of Future Skills 2030. And so incorporating these estimates also in this framework would be useful and important. In terms of the sensitivity of different occupational similarity measures, they all are so they all have correlations. So all these measures are kind of correlated, but they're also kind of looking at different things. And we haven't yet done sort of a very vast sort of robustness tests for redoing the same analysis using different types of similarity measures. But what we are doing is we are validating these similarity measures by doing a crowdsourcing exercise where we ask people's perceptions of how actually they think, how viable the transition is, how feasible it is. And so we will then use this to kind of look at the impact, first of all, how, which of the similarity measures is the most predictive of people's perceptions, and then how maybe we can combine these similarity measures in a better way to kind of better predict basically the people's perceptions. And as a final note, also that there's just so many different ways how this could be done. And so I think, we need basically some gold standard data sets, and ideally we could, if you could get our hands on real life transitions, from surveys or from data that, for example, LinkedIn has, or some people with lots of CVs have. So that would be really amazing, and then we could really, I think, say something about which measures are the best.
Thanks for that question, Bashan. Thanks for the answer, Karlis. I must admit, when I see some CVs, it's quite fascinating when you look at people's career path as in past. Sometimes it's not easy to join the dots, but we're all different. So I know some people have raised their hands. It'd be helpful if you can put the question in writing. So we'll come back to you, but next, I'll come to Yorgi in a moment, but first I'll go to Michaela Vecchi. If you want, we'll unmute you if you want to ask your question, please.
Hi, I think I've unmuted myself, but if not, please, if you can hear me, let me know. Okay. Just a couple of points. It's an excellent presentation. I really enjoyed this topic, Karlis, so excellent, well done. just the first point is about dance, because I've seen that in your study, dance is a job, an occupation that cannot easily be replaced by automation. And in October, there was a very unfortunate government campaign showing the picture of Fatima, who is a ballet dancer, and recommending Fatima that her next job could be in cyber. So I don't know if you've seen this. It generated a lot of criticism on social media. So basically the advert said Fatima's next job could be in cyber. But according to your study, this is not in the long term a very good recommendation. And the other point, maybe I've missed it because there's so much information what you told us today. But I have not seen very many similarities of different occupations with the occupations within the health sector. For example, stewards and stewardesses, there's been cases during COVID where they have retrained and joined the health sector because they already have certain skills like resuscitating people or first help in case of people not feeling well, that can easily be adapted within the health sector. And the same for dancers, and dancing is increasingly used for improving the conditions of people affected by dementia and Parkinson's disease. So I don't know whether you've looked into this at all, or whether there might be other links, other similarities that are not coming through with your methodology.
Yeah.
Karlis, before you get going, if you can get a brief answer, then we've got a couple more questions, but we'll go on for about another 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your points and your questions. I fully agree with the Fatima advertisement is kind of a bit perhaps silly, but yeah. So I think the question that you ask points towards which aspects of the occupation we should take into account. And so in the present framework, we're using the very specific skills of ESCoE, and it could be that because they play kind of a big part in establishing the similarity, that we might not see sort of immediate relationship or close relationship between, say, I guess what you mentioned, like stewards and care workers. But we could use sort of higher level features, or like, or broader aspects, like, for example, working with other people, or using communication, or first aid, or things like that. And so probably we would not have to kind of consider which aspects of similarity we want to stress and take into account. And also, I haven't kind of studied this into too much detail. I haven't actually checked how close our healthcare destinations for service sector workers. Perhaps they're not deemed viable by the algorithm, but perhaps they are one of the most similar, cross-sectoral transitions. I just haven't looked at it. Yeah.
Okay, thanks for that, Karlis. We'll come nearing the end, but a couple of questions left. One is from Georgi Vasiliev from ONS, who's not on the call at the moment. So he said a fascinating talk. The question he's got is about constraining to the SOC-based jobs, and whether for policy and wider use, is it not worth moving away from SOC-based jobs to the job title?
I think that's a good question. So I think in terms of, so I agree. The short answer is I agree, but also I think there's a tremendous value, of course, of having the SOC and having to be able to link lots of other information to these occupations. And this is something that we also, one of the next steps is to kind of validate a bit more and review the links between the ESCoE occupations and the UK SOC codes, and then it just becomes much more powerful, the framework. Okay. And then I think also the next sort of iteration of SOC, which adds another digit, I think is also really good. I think in the new iteration, there are about 1,500 occupations, if I'm not mistaken. So this is already a great step forward.
Yeah, obviously with the development of certain IT, web, etc., that's really important to get a greater granularity. I'll move to essentially the last question. Keshab, if you want to, we'll unmute you if you can quickly ask your question. Thank you.
Thank you, Karlis. This was a nice presentation. My question is about the policies, like the job support scheme. As we know from COVID and then even earlier, we had benefits of the wage support and all different kind for different jobs. So you have fantastically found out the characteristics of different jobs and similarities and the transition. So when government changes these policies, so I think that the nature of the transition matrix also should change. So what do you think? How do you, have you tackled this issue, or can you explain a bit about it? Thank you.
Thanks. I think it's a big question. I don't know if I can not give a rumbly answer in the short amount of time, but I would just say that we just hope that this kind of map of jobs can be used as a policy tool as well. And there's probably still quite a few steps to do to make it a sort of usable tool. But by making this open to everybody, it's important also to be transparent for scrutiny. We hope that we can get there.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Karlis, what I would suggest is, I think your link to policy, you want to get it in there as soon as possible, and then evolve what material analysis you can provide to support the policy, and or if the policy wants to have something different, but you've got a lot of potential there. And then my only final point will be, if you get the greater granularity, is the regional dimension. If you can get down to local authority level, there's huge possibilities there, especially as we, dare I say, come out of Brexit, etc. There's going to be lots of regional, industrial, age-related changes that take place, and transition analysis is going to be very important. So thank you very much again, Karlis. That's a really intriguing presentation. Thank you to the audience and the questions from the audience. Well, I'd also just remind people two things again. The next presentation won't be until next year, possibly the 14th of January with Martin Wheel. And obviously, if you want to make any presentations at the next conference, there's a call for papers deadline for the ESCoE 2021 conference for the 16th of January. Otherwise, I would just now say thank you very much for today. And also the ESCoE support team, not as in the classifications team, but ESCoE team. And a healthy, joyous end of year break for all. And look forward to seeing you in 2021. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you. Have a nice day.